Well, hello, and welcome to another episode of the Laughter for All podcast. I have a great show for you. I have a friend who's wise and wrote a book called The Way of Interruption. So, if you want to learn, if you run an organization or a ministry or a church or you name it, you need to be watching us right now.
Welcome to Laughter for All. It's the podcast with Comedian Nazareth.
Well, hello, and welcome to another episode of the Laughter for All podcast. I am Comedian Nazareth, and thank you for joining me on episode 240 uh, in the last 5.5 years. So, thank you for subscribing. Thank you for being, for watching. I appreciate it. I just got back from Florence, Oregon. If you need a vacation, people, and you don't want to go overseas or you don't want to go to Hawaii, or you don't want to go to Alaska. Those are my favorite, like they're beautiful places. Alaska, Hawaii, and Florida, humid. But anyway, you need to go to the Oregon coast. I did a men's conference. I actually spoke at the men's conference. I actually did comedy for half an hour every session, and then did a message. And I did that 3 times, and I got the message. And this is I'm not bragging. This is has nothing to brag about. But this is what I got from the pastor, who's a friend of mine. Naz, I think this was the best event yet. I had so many calls, texts, and emails already thankful for your message. They were spot on, and you did a terrific job. Boom. I normally get those for comedy, but to get them for messages too, that was interesting. I made new friends. I love it. But uh, if you want to know where I'm going to be next, just go to my website, nazarethusa.com, or you can subscribe to this. Anyway, enough of this. I have a friend. I've known him for years. He used to be the president of Berean bookstores. Remember bookstores? I don't know why they left. I think Amazon and social media took, but that was the best place to go. The bookstore, the Christian bookstores, and they have a section for the Catholics, section for the Pentecostals because it was louder, and section for us normal people to be. I'm just kidding. To be able to look at books, and they used to carry my DVDs and my stuff, so it was great. And then he had me come to Ohio and did an event for him, and then he started becoming well, he didn't start, he became the CEO and president of a ministry organization called the American Leprosy Missions, which just changed their name to Hope Rises International. Just a great man of God. Bill has been the CEO of national and international organizations in the for-profit and non-profit world for over 2 decades. Since 2010, he has served as president and CEO of Hope Rises International, formerly American Leprosy Missions, which was founded in 1906. He has been blessed to lead many boards and organizations around the world, and most recently began serving as chair of the board for the Accord Network. His experience running Christian ministry organizations for his entire career, coupled with a life altering 3 months sabbatical experience a few years ago, has shaped his desire to write and think about the role of spiritual practices in Christian parachurch ministries. Bill's book, The Way of Interruption, released in March of 2025. This month it was released. Bill and his wife Cindy live in Greenville, South Carolina. Bill graduated from University of Tennessee with a bachelor in political science and is pursuing postgraduate studies in spiritual formation at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. Bill has been featured on the New York Times, Nonprofit Pro, Authority Magazine, and the Leprosy Review. Please welcome my friend Bill Simmons. Hello, Bill. Okay, now the voice is gone. Is there's a button we can
This
click?
thing.
Here we go. We're back.
Nope. Yeah. Am I here? Am I here?
Yeah, I can
We're
hear you.
live. Great. Yeah, it's great to be here. And actually, the book came out today. So
Wow, I'm so
that's-
honored.
I thought, who would I like to talk to today when the book comes out? Nazareth, my old friend.
Oh,
So
thank
yeah,
you, my
it
friend.
came out today, available everywhere. So yeah, it's great to be here. I remember those old days when you could buy books in more places than your front porch when they just get dropped there. I remember that.
No, there is another Greenville that one time I flew into, and I
Mhm.
was at the wrong airport. Greenville, North Carolina.
There, yeah, well, it can be. There's Greensboro and Greenville. I think somebody on your one of your watchers and listeners can prove this wrong, but I think that maybe other than Alaska and Hawaii, every all the other 48 states have a Greenville. I think that's true. There's a Greenville in every state in the United States. Yeah.
But there's one where I flew. I remember one time I flew to the wrong airport, but
I
they
I
said
can't
no,
help you
you
with that.
need to be in Greenville. No, I know you couldn't, but I
That had to
still
be in
made
the
it to the
days.
show on time because
Yeah, that had to be before 9/11. Back when we had paper tickets and you could board planes and get on the wrong airplane. Yeah,
uh,
absolutely.
no, it wasn't the wrong airplane. I booked it to Greenville. I think it was Greenville,
Oh,
North
yes.
Carolina.
I
It's
see.
small airport,
I see.
but anyway, yeah, you used to be at Berean, and then you went to American Leprosy Foundation missions, and what was that like? You had to travel a lot internationally, right, Bill?
I have, yeah. I think 2 years ago, I realized that I had been on something like 1,200 flights in 10 years, um, and I realized how much time it was because I fly a lot of long haul flights. So I think it meant that 6 months of my life had been spent in an airplane. Just if you add up all the hours, it's a lot of hours. It's a lot
Uh,
of, and you fly a lot too. If you fly enough, you realize that there's nothing that makes you sometimes feel less like a human being than being inside of a tin can for a lot of hours. You just I've never been my best self on an airplane. That's not something I found to be true. It's a
and
strange experience.
you're right, but so you probably with Delta? Are you with Delta or with
I
American?
do, yeah, deliver every living thing through Atlanta. That's what I do, fly through Atlanta.
How is your kids felt about you traveling that much?
Yeah, I think I wish they were here to answer that question. I had to over time decelerate that. I traveled a lot 14 years ago, probably too much. I started to try to. I got to a point where I would never take a trip longer than 10 days. That I knew that was the longest that was good for me and good for my family. And then about 3 or 4 years ago, well, actually during COVID, when everyone's travel habits changed. After COVID, I changed my pattern, which was instead of traveling all the time, I had to argue myself into why I needed to travel.
Mm.
And I had to find a positive reason to go instead of just always moving and taking the next meeting or the next event or the next thing around the world. It had to be compelling because I learned through that period that really family really is the most important thing. We think ministry and some of these things are more important sometime, and I actually think they're not. The place God can get a replacement for me is in my ministry, but He can't get
Mm.
a replacement for me in my home, in my family, and in my marriage. And so there's nowhere that's more important now. And I don't think certainly throughout my career it was maybe not always the case, but that's what I aspire to try to manage to that in my life now. Yeah.
Is that what you wanted to do when you were young? Like, I one day I want
Yes.
to be running a
Right.
ministry, a
Yeah.
huge
I
ministry
think
like
that's
that.
hilarious. I think that's, I think we stumble into God's will and His vocation for our lives. I think I tell people that this is my dream job. I just never knew to dream it. And that's how it feels. It's one of those things where I love what I do. I love getting to work with partners around the world to help people that the rest of the world tends to forget about. And I love that I get to help make that happen. And I didn't know I should dream about it. Right. That's definitely true. And the journey to get here was certainly an interesting one. But yeah, I love it. I love and you mentioned at the beginning that we were American Leprosy Mission since, well, actually not since 1906, since the mid 1950s. because
Oh.
it used to be that you could say the word leper, and that's still in a lot of some translations still use that word.
Mm.
But most people who have leprosy would prefer you didn't say that, didn't use that word, because you can't ever say that word positively. And we don't usually talk about other people who have diseases. Like we wouldn't say someone who had cancer was a cancerite or something. So it's I don't think people, because it's in the Bible, it's sort of hard to get our minds around what's actually, if someone had leprosy, it feels bad. But I think, what we get to do is work with that. And so the organization in 1906 was founded as the American Mission to Lepers. and
Oh,
and
okay.
so yeah, so in the 50s, the world has started to learn maybe that's not a term that's very helpful to people who actually have the disease of leprosy, and so they changed it to American Leprosy Missions. And now we sort of have two other problems. One is that people who have leprosy actually wish we would just call it Hansen's disease, and
Hansen,
not
is that what it is? It's
was what
Hansen disease?
that's exactly, that's the disease, and they just wish we would call it that because people don't conjure up all sorts of images in their mind when you say leprosy. When you say Hansen's disease, when you
Han
say leprosy, you're thinking Ten Commandments or The Robe, whatever movies in your mind. And I, and then a lot of questions that I get often is there still leprosy in the world? And so, for this generation, what we really wanted to do is say, what, we're about hope. Well, that's what we're about for
Mm.
people who are marginalized by these terrible diseases. And so, let's stop talking about the problem and talk about, the outcome, what we see happen in people's lives. And so, we wanted to invite a new generation into our work after 119 years. And so, yeah, we became American Leprosy Missions became Hope Rises International last Wednesday. So also new off the press.
I'm glad I got all the fresh stuff from you already
That's right.
on this.
That's right.
Now, is there's leprosy in America, in the United States? Are
There
there
is there is some leprosy in the United States. People in the U.S. get it from armadillos in Florida and Texas, and then some people, the Pacific Islands, the Marshall Islands, the places like that have more leprosy than a lot of places in the world, and they can immigrate freely into the U.S. And so, usually, there are people who come in who have leprosy, but leprosy is so difficult to catch. It's like no one needs to worry about somebody coming to the U.S. with leprosy and them getting it. That's not an issue. That's not an immigration concern we have. Is somebody getting leprosy that way? You and I are the least likely people to be able to get leprosy. It's just very unlikely. Maybe not impossible, but almost impossible. So,
Yeah, can
yeah,
you hold on? My armadillo is just, I forgot to
yep.
put food for my armadillo.
Nine,
Armadillos can give you
nine,
leprosy?
no, no, yeah, I can't explain. The nine-banded armadillos, which are in the southern U.S. and down into South America. Yep, they not only do they get leprosy, but they present symptoms of leprosy the same way human beings do. So they get nerve damage, and they end up getting disability and deformity because of that. And so, yeah, so they get it, but somewhere along the way, and I can't explain this to you either, but the DNA of the leprosy that they have started with a human being. So I don't know how an armadillo got leprosy from a human, several hundred years ago, but somewhere along the way they had a bad encounter. So, and I can't tell you how a human being gets leprosy from an armadillo. No one knows the answer to that question either. So,
Wow.
mysteries.
So I know we're not physicians, we don't want to spend a lot of time on that, but what is the symptoms? Do people, is it like, I used to think like you're cursed and then you get leprosy
Hmm.
because that's what the Bible said. But I
Hmm.
mean,
Hmm.
when you get leprosy, is that the changes of the color of the skin? Because sometimes you see people with the skin color different. Is that leprosy?
Probably not. It's probably some sort of dermatological condition that's not leprosy. Leprosy is actually, if you get leprosy patches, they're very difficult to spot, which is why sometimes it can go on too long because even a well-educated doctor might not notice the patches because they're very, very difficult to see. The 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 loss of nerve function is what happens first. So you might start to feel loss of sensation in your fingers or your hands, and in your feet, that sort of thing. And that's the symptom. So it's generally not initially a visible sort of a thing. It's more of a nerve thing that starts to happen, and which is why leprosy probably what we call leprosy today was probably not in the Bible. That's not what Jesus was healing in Luke 17 when he met the men outside the camp that had leprosy. They didn't have Hansen's disease. Almost certainly they didn't have Hansen's disease,
Ah,
but they would have had other diseases that would have meant people were outcast and separated from society. And so that's the other reason we changed our name, is because we work in these villages and communities where people have 3 or 4 diseases that are very similar. They're not all Hansen's disease, and I don't want to bore you with the scientific terms for all these diseases, but the result is that people are excluded, they're marginalized, they're cast out, and they're treated as less than human. And so in that sense, they all have leprosy. They all are people who have leprosy, and they're the same people that Jesus went to in Luke 17. And so I sort of summarize our ministry this way, Nazareth. I say in Luke 17, Jesus went to those men and he did 2 things. He healed them, because it says as they went, they were made clean.
yeah.
And then he sent them to a priest, which is very unusual. He doesn't do that with anybody else that he heals. He never sends somebody to a priest after he heals them, but he sends the people with leprosy because he needed them to be reintegrated back into their communities. And the priest was the one that could declare them, sanction them that
Clean.
they were clean and they could go home. And so Jesus did those 2 things. And that's what we do. We work with Christian hospitals around the world to help ensure that people are getting the medical treatment they need so that they can be healed physically from these diseases, which all have medicine that can treat them. And then we work with pastors and churches who play the role of helping to reintegrate people who have been excluded back into their community. And so we get to model that exact example that Jesus laid out in Luke 17. And that's the easiest way I've ever found to explain what we do. So
That,
that's what we do. And that's
that,
why it's Hope Rises.
yeah. Last question about this is, so you travel a lot over there, and where would be the country that mostly you guys work with?
We work primarily in Central and West Africa, from Liberia all the way around Nigeria down into the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where I grew up. And then we work in India, Nepal, the Philippines, and in that part of the world. Yeah.
Uh, Speaking of where you grew up, I know one time you almost got killed. And tell us, how did you grow up? Was your parents missionaries?
Yeah. I was born in Tennessee, but my parents became missionaries when I was just about to start middle school. So great time to move as a child. Ask your middle schoolers if they want to move today. So I did get to move, but actually it was a great experience. Changed my life forever. And my parents became missionaries, and yeah, and I grew up in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It was Zaire when I lived there, and
Zaire, yeah, I remember
yeah,
that
yeah,
name.
graduated high school there, and yeah, in my book I tell this story about this time I was headed out on a date as a senior in high school, and parked my car out on the river road and was going to go to a restaurant. But before I could get out of the car, I hear this tapping on the glass, and look over, and it's a child soldier with an AK-47 asking me to get out of the vehicle. And so all sorts of things go through your mind, or don't, maybe, when that sort of thing happens. Everything slows down, like everyone says. It's one of those events I can remember still so well today. When I forget everything else at my age, I can remember this really, really well. And so it's sort of sealed in my mind. So I thought, how am I going to get out of this? Am I going to get out of this? I tried to be so persuasive with words. That didn't work. He's
In
He's
English, were you speaking to him, or in his
no,
language?
I would have been speaking in French, and
French.
and Congolese French, Belgian French. And yeah, and he pulled the slide back and loaded it around in, and he wasn't kidding around. And you can't you can't trust a child soldier. You don't know, what they're thinking, or if they're on drugs. You have no idea. And so yeah, I was completely without the ability to control that situation. Ultimately, I did probably what everyone else would do, which was, hey, don't you take all my money, and that was an easy decision. So I gave him all my money, which was probably a year's worth of salary for a child soldier, but gave that to him, and he did actually sort of fade off into the night, and I didn't see him again. But I start the book with that story because it was the sort of moment in life that it takes years later for you to recall and realize that it's those sorts of moments
Hmm.
uh, that can lead to a person becoming hyper vigilant and also sort of making sure that nothing bad ever happens again. So you're always mitigating. You're always trying to be in control of the situation so
Mm.
that things don't go sideways. Because when they go sideways, they go really sideways, and so you can end up building a whole life that subtly is about how you're in control and managing control. And so I start the book there because the book is about what does it mean to really give up control and do some things differently in a person's life or in one's life. And that story just really reminds me of how infrequently we're in control, and if we are, we're it's a delusion or an illusion. You talk about flying. I'm convinced that people are less afraid of flying; they're more afraid of not being in control. They get
Mm.
onto an airplane and they have to give up control, to the pilot, and they're fine if they're in their car, which is more dangerous. But flying that airplane, they're not in control anymore. And I think it's the
Mm.
one time where we're like, okay, I can't do anything about any of this. Not that you could do anything about it on the highway either. We just think that we can.
Right.
So I think yes, control is a thing that comes into our lives, and it's the thing that God is always asking us to surrender, right? And so that's the journey. That's the journey.
So now, I last 2 days ago, I was teaching a message about waiting on the Lord, and the reason we don't like to wait on the Lord because we are not in control. See, if we're in control, but what I'm saying, if you're so, what you're saying to executives of nonprofits or to CEOs and stuff, don't be in control. Is that what you're saying in the book?
Yes and no. I would say I think what I'm inviting anyone to is a journey of trying to understand what in our lives are we holding on to, and we're trying to exert control over, because those are things that that will burn us out. And so the book is really more about burnout, because I think burnout is a result of us running so hard and trying to keep everything buttoned down and working in order, and maybe overworking to make sure things don't go wrong, or we're stressing ourselves out to make sure we're put all the weight on ourselves. The whole ministry must be my responsibility, and so we carry these weights around, and I think they tend to be related to how we're trying to exert control over outcomes. And so in that sense, what I'm inviting people to is to move to a simpler way. Is That's really what I'm inviting people to, is not actually focus on the problem, but instead focus on just simple ways and let God do some things, and the control will sort of take care of itself.
So, what do you do when you're okay? You're on a you're a CEO of a nonprofit. The nonprofit is dependent on donations, on donors, on
Mm.
people giving money, and you need to have that money to continue the work and the mission. How do you let control? I mean, many times, you say, okay, Lord will provide, God will take care of it. I mean, how much control do you let go when it comes to raising funds for the nonprofit?
Yeah, I there's no easy answer to that question, because I still think about raising funds, probably every day. I still think about it. It's what's my relationship to it, and how am I oriented toward it? And I hear those things. At my age, I've heard plenty of plenty of sermons about letting go and letting God, and just releasing things.
Yeah.
And so I think there's not any one thing that a person can do. And so what what I had to discover was that all of my self-generative activity, whether that's at work or in my spiritual life, constantly reinventing my, quiet time or morning time. I'm always coming, what's new? What's the next thing? When nothing's working, how do I work? What do I need to do?
Mm.
And, I was actually at an airport in Ghana about 3 years ago. And I was trying to get home to see my family. And I had this moment where I realized, wait a minute, there's a problem with my airplane seat, which doesn't matter. As this zero real in the scheme of the world is nothing matter. But there wasn't my right seat. It was something had gone wrong. I'm on the phone with the airline for like 2 hours. I'm losing chance to, am I going to miss my flight? And I had this sort of out of body experience where I'm thinking, is this what a nervous breakdown, if there is such a thing? Is this what this is like? I'm and I'm asking myself, why can't I just be more zen and quiet here and just let this happen? What is it?
Mm.
And I had a wonderful Christian friend of mine who she did trauma work. She's a psychiatrist and works for a ministry in Serbia and Bosnia with people who have survived war. And I was sharing this in a meeting with her, and she said, Bill, it's what you're describing sounds like burnout.
Mm.
And I thought, burnout? That's not a what is that? I don't. Who gets burnout? That isn't. That was not. It did not compute. I don't know. I don't know if you've had burnout or not, Nazareth. But I was not. And also, it's not something that in circles that I'm around that anyone says, "Hey, you know what I have this week? Burnout." No,
Yeah.
no, no one's wearing it.
I'm
I
sure
don't.
we get it, but we don't know how to explain what it is. What's the symptoms of a burnout? For you, it was like you're getting frustrated with traveling, or you were like entitled to certain things
Yeah, I think
because you're
that
tired.
no, that moment, I think the moment was not the issue, and all of those things leaked into all of my work, and to all
Mm.
of yeah, I think, in the book I talk about, I'm not advocating for this series, but, in this TV show, Succession, it's a really gross picture of leadership, and there's a CEO who, has all these people who have these fancy titles, but they never get to actually do anything because he undermines them. He disempowers them over and over again. And in sort of watching that, I needed to see this sort of grotesque version
Hmm.
to say, wait a minute, I think I do some of that. Maybe not that way, but I've disempowered my staff before. I've undermined people. And why am I doing that? Is it because I don't love them or I don't want the best for the organization? No, and for me it was I'm influencing, I'm controlling, like the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain. I'm never able to just let it go and release other people to thrive, release certain things to happen. Why can't I just release that? So it had been an accumulation that started with things like that story of the soldier, right?
Mm.
Because if you have those sorts of things happen in your life, then you never go into a restaurant and sit with your back to the door. I mean, that's a real thing. I never do that.
Oh.
That's not. I would not do that. I always knew where all the points of exit were. I always knew when you grow up in a place like the Congo where there's violence and things happening, you're always ready for something to. And you never. There's a crowd, there's commotion. You never run toward it. You never go toward things. You're always going away. So how does
Mm.
that show up in business and running an organization? I think things show up like that. So I had to go on a long journey to see that, to see how I was becoming exhausted, how much energy I was putting into being in control. So being in the airport was just, an example of where
Mm.
one more time I put so much energy into making sure everything is exactly right, even
Wow.
my airplane seat, right? So everything, I can tell you, you probably can tell me this too. Do you know, probably every aircraft and where all the seats are and which part of the airplane you want to sit on because you've
Of
flown on
course.
so many airplanes,
Of
right?
course. I can
So
tell you when a beep a ring, I know exactly what is it for.
every single thing. So we I had to find a way to get out of that, but God took me put me in front of some great people, Christian therapists that helped me see some of that,
Mm.
and then my board. I had some other people said, maybe you should consider a sabbatical. And so I went to my board, and my board was so supportive of that. And so I took a 3-month sabbatical, and that's really when everything changed forever in many ways,
How?
forever.
What did you do in that sabbatical? What was a typical thing, like one of
Hmm.
the things you did to
This is going to be radical. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. Nothing.
You did nothing. Oh, what is nothing? Like, were you just
Al-
watching TV sitting on the
Almost,
recliner, or were you just
almost. almost nothing. I didn't do completely nothing, but almost. And here's why. Because for someone who is addicted to control and making sure everything runs right, the last thing you need is to have a sabbatical that's completely planned out, is all mapped out. And now instead of being the CEO of my organization, I'm the CEO of the world's greatest sabbatical. And that's not the point, and I think God gives the instruction to Moses. He gives it in Exodus, but Leviticus 25 is more commonly cited, where he said in the seventh year, the land should lie fallow. And, your manservant and your ox and your donkeys, nothing works. And you can maybe pick some fruit up off the ground, but you can't plant anything. And, I mean, what does a farmer do for a year if he can't plant anything? Nothing. It
Nothing.
does nothing.
Right.
It does nothing. And so I really tried to do that. I tried to say, okay, God, I'm going to have a couple of little things on my calendar for 3 months, but everything else is just going to be no plan, being present, I never had to say no to my grandkids or my children. When people wanted to do things, I was able to do it. If I wanted to get up and read, I wanted to sleep late. That's what I did. And not once in that 3 months did I have a prayer where I asked God something about my ministry or a
Mm.
vision. I said, nope, that would have been sneakily tilling the ground. So I left it alone. And I did plan a trip, and we'll get to that in a minute. But ultimately, that sabbatical was sort of the culmination of a journey. It wasn't like God solved all the problems just in that 90 days, an amazing 90 days. It was an amazing 90 days, but I had been working through this for a couple of years, and the sabbatical was sort of the punctuation mark in a process. And I really leaned into that. And 2 days after I came back from my sabbatical, having had not a single prayer about our organization, never wondering what we should do, I never. 2 days later, I knew as clear as day that God was calling us very clearly as an organization to return to our founding purpose in 1917. The only part of our mission statement documents that haven't changed since 1917 are the words that say, "We exist to proclaim the gospel to people affected by leprosy and related diseases." It's the only
Mm.
thing that hasn't changed. And so we said, that's what we're going to do. Not that we weren't doing it, but
Mm.
I think, we needed to change some things to make sure that's what we were doing, and that we were adding that into the kingdom and doing it well. Otherwise, we could just become any other medical
Exactly.
nonprofit, and that's not what God called us to do. And so it felt pretty radical to some people, I think, in our organization. But most people were like, yeah, this is exactly what we want to do. Can we do more of that? And it's absolutely,
Yes.
it's what we're going to do. So we started doing that. We've been doing that for a couple of years, sort of returning to our
True.
founding purpose. But I never once thought about that during my sabbatical before. And I've just released that and the organization and people to do their work. And I try to stay out of the way. I haven't become perfect yet, so it's not perfect, and that I'm not pursuing perfection. I just want to know that God is in everything that we're doing, and that's different. And then the practices evolved out of that. That's really what the book is about. So,
That's right. It's funny. Yesterday I had a board meeting with my board and my executive director, and that's the thing. One of the things I told him, I said, "Listen, we need to be more active in bringing Christ into what we do every day. We have to be. That would be on the mind of every employee or
mhm,
every worker. Is like, how can I bring Christ to this person, to this
mhm,
refugee, to this person?"
mhm,
But in your book you talk about the old practices of the churches,
mhm,
right, or the Christianity in the past,
mhm.
and how to apply that to today's nonprofit
Yep,
tell us more about
yep,
how did you write the book, how long it took you to write
yep.
the book.
How long? About 4 months
Four
of
months
s- of serious writing. 4 months of writing. But the book is not. The book is more of a tool than it is sort of a traditional book. There's a third
Mm.
of the book is sort of me talking about the practices, and then the rest of the book talks about using psalms in the workplace. It talks about we have a lot of prayers for the workplace, prayer liturgies, if you want to call them that. They were written by people who are in our organization or who are CEOs of organizations all around the world, and they've written prayers for organizational life. Because I don't know if you've seen, Andrew Peterson and Rabbit Room Press. They have these Every Moment Holy series, and
Mm.
people love these books, and they're different liturgies and prayers for all different things in life, but there aren't things for organizational life.
Mm.
Having a prayer for, when you hire a new staff person or someone goes on maternity leave, or I have ministries that have some of the water organizations that do water projects, and they have a prayer for a new water project, or a prayer for someone who for a person suffering from being trafficked, and how do you deal with that. So we have these prayers all that are also in the book, that enable people to pray together over these issues that a lot of organizations face. And so, what I tried to do was, when I went, one of the few things I had on my calendar in my sabbatical was a trip um, to New Mexico,
Mm.
to Christ in the Desert Monastery. And this is the most remote monastery in the Western Hemisphere. Have you ever been there?
No, not that
No.
one. No, I've been to.
So,
I mean, I came from a Greek Orthodox background, so yeah.
oh, so you went to Athos?
Yeah,
No,
used
that's
to.
a hard one to get to. Yeah, so it's an hour drive off of already a difficult road, um, and I got there, and what I'd learned from, and I hadn't been to a monastery before. Let me be clear. And I did not grow up Roman Catholic, but I learned more from these Roman Catholic monks and Christians there than maybe in a lot of other churches I've been in, just because it's what I needed. It's what God needed to show me, right? And
Mm.
what I saw was that these monks, they have a pattern. They pray seven, depending on the monastery, 7 or 8 times a day, starting at 3 or 4 in the morning, and they do that every day. And the prayers that they do together generally are 75% of the time it's Psalms, and then they read maybe the gospel, something else. And that's what they do. They do that
Mm.
every day of every year. And what I realized was, they have to run a monastery. They have a nonprofit sort of organization to run too, right? They've got
Right.
guests to feed. They've got to raise some funds to make sure the elderly monks have health care. They have to do all these things. They have a whole organization to run.
I did
And
not
so,
know that. I never
yeah,
thought of it that way.
yeah,
You're right.
yeah,
They have to
yeah.
run. They have to have some. I thought people just come bring them food
And
and
they're raising their own goats, and they do all of these things, and so they have work to do. Is the point. And uh, but I realized, wait a minute, they're interrupting their work 7 or 8 times a day to pray,
mm,
and that's how important prayers are. Or you could flip it around and say, are they interrupting their prayer to work? Which is it? And so that's where, there's another story. I won't spoil all of the book. There's another story
yeah.
about, really, about interruption in the book, but the idea is, that's where the idea of the way of interruption came. That seeing these men interrupt their day over and over again and creating a pattern. The pattern was about that reading the Psalms and reorienting themselves to God was more important than the work they had to do.
Mm,
And so that pattern was never broken. They didn't take, it's like, oh, we're just not going to pray today, or we don't feel like it, because it wasn't about them. So that's the biggest thing that I've learned, in a personal way, is that my own spiritual life is not, if I aim it at me,
mm,
then it's, I may not get anything today. Maybe I don't get anything for 30 days. So do I give up? Well, I do, if it's about me. If my spiritual practices are about how full I feel, or how great I feel like God has spoken to me. But if
mm.
every day I know that I'm spending time reorienting myself to God, if I'm
Like,
reading Psalms out loud again to God, then how is that not a good day? Even
yeah.
if I don't feel different. No, because I'm giving God what's due to him. God deserves me reading back the Psalms of praise to him. He deserves me reminding myself, if I bow or kneel, as to remind myself that, there's something God is worth bowing or kneeling to. I don't want to wait until the end when every knee must bow and every tongue confess. I'd rather bow some now and confess some now. then do it then. And
Bill, it's just very interesting and timely because, as I said, I came from a Greek Orthodox background, which I knew nothing about Christ. I didn't personally.
Mhm,
It's not. I know some great Greek Orthodox
sure.
Christians, and when I became a born again Christian, one time I saw my cousin reading prayer book, and I got upset. I said, no, 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 no. You cannot just be using repetitions. Jesus said,
Mhm,
never repeat. You have to be, it's a relationship with Christ, and you
mhm,
have to just, make up your own words and what you're
mhm,
going through. But then now I'm turning to the like, what's better prayer than praying the Psalms?
mhm.
Because if you let your mind wander and waiting to come up with words, you've already somewhere else. Your flesh
Yep.
has taken you somewhere. So I like that idea that you're giving people psalm or prayers that they can pray for certain parts
Mhm.
of the work. That's very very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and the idea, so in a practical way, so then what does this matter in a organization? So the reason it matters is, I'll finish the personal story to say that,
Yeah,
um, you know, in giving up control and having to release all these things, the strange thing is that I found myself in, being drawn to more traditional ancient practices of the church, to this pattern you're talking about that the church has
yeah.
been having for 2,000 years. That So that's a strange thing, right? Someone's trying to give up control, adopt sort of a system that's sort of a little more formal.
Good.
um, but I found more liberty in that, and I even talk about in the book that we have certain practices in our
Can
in
you
our
give
own.
us a little
Yeah,
bit of that? Just a little. I don't want
yeah,
to
no,
spoil the book, but just tell us some of those practices that you adopted.
yeah. So what we do is, um, in the same sort of rhythm of interruption, we do something we call pausing first, because, this is the thing that we never do in today's world with back-to-back Zoom meetings. And so I really try to say that we just need to, can we take 30 seconds, maybe even 3 minutes? Can we just be quiet for a second? Like, everybody just got off a Zoom call or just came from something, and no one's in the room yet. They're still catching up to themselves. We never take a minute to catch up to ourselves.
Mm,
And I think that's important, because I think Jesus modeled that. I think Jesus was, what did he do over and over again? He was never in a hurry.
right.
People are like, why didn't you get over here to raise Lazarus faster? Or why didn't you get to Jairus' daughter faster? Or, he's going off into the wilderness for 40 days before his ministry started. I mean, he's never in a hurry.
Right.
He's always present to people around him. And so I think we lose that because we think, oh, ministry is really important. We have a big agenda. Everything's really important. We got to get it done today. Let's go, 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 go. That's not true. Don't forget. I mean, right now, Nazareth, you and I are the only two people. I mean, I can see you and you can see me. So it's the only place I can see the imago Dei, the image of God, right now, is in you. I need
Mm,
to show up to that. I need to be present to that, because I think Christ would have been present to it, and we can't do that if I got two screens. I'm looking at my phone. I'm thinking about the last meeting or whatever I did. So we try to just take a second,
uh,
collect yourself. So we do that every time. We take a brief pause, and then we read a psalm. So we have a morning psalm, an afternoon psalm. We read the psalm. One
as
somebody
with
re-
the staff.
Yeah, this is in a
How
meet
many how many
every
staff do
meeting.
you have? Do you have?
We have, I don't know, we have 35 staff around the world, and then
Oh.
but then we have other partners. So we're doing this every meeting. So I may hear the morning psalm 4 or 5 times. I haven't figured out why that's bad yet. I don't know why that was going to be bad. I don't how that psalm's going to get old. It's already old. It's thousands of years old. Why am I? How's it going to get old? It's
That's
just
right.
just just say it out loud. So we just pray. This is Everyone knows this passage in Timothy, where the scripture of God is, it's God breathed, right? I think it's 2 Timothy 2:15. Um, but that word is theonoustos, which is theo is God. Everyone knows that.
Yeah.
Noustos is a spirit that breathed out again. And so I
Mm,
like this idea that when we say psalms, we speak them out again. God's word is alive in the world again. And that's what I hear from those people. When they think, well, that's really dry how they're doing it every day. Well, I don't know. When is God? God never said, well, you have to sing it or say it this way, and then it's really awesome.
Right.
That's if we want it to be about us. If it's about God, we just speak the psalm out, and then we pray. And maybe sometimes the psalms are prayer, so maybe that's enough. Maybe we need to pray briefly about something else. It's so simple that it's almost embarrassing. Like, I'm really saying that's all we should do. But here's why. Here's why I'm not embarrassed about it. Because in my work, I have discovered after 20 years, you mentioned Berean earlier. I've been in a type of Christian ministry, parachurch ministry, for all of my career. And there's explicit and implicit expectations.
Mm.
So the explicit expectation is that I know how to run an organization, run a business. I know how to manage this, and we're going to do this well. We have a mission and a ministry, and I can do that part. There's an implicit expectation,
Mm.
and that is that somehow I also have a vocational call to be a pastor, and I should be spiritually dynamic and should have all of these. I should help, spiritually form my staff and my team.
Mm.
And that implicit expectation is exhausting. Eugene Peterson, you know him.
Yeah.
He had a book. I think it's called The Pastor, and he talks about the opposite. How he loved teaching, preaching. He said, but I hated running the church. I hated it. It was draining, because pastors have the opposite. They're expected to teach and preach, but then they're also implicitly, in today's world, expected to know how to run big machinery church organizations too. And a lot of pastors are drained by that. And so I think I discovered that this constant implicit, so no one's out there saying I have to do this, but I feel a big burden to somehow keep inventing new ways to have spiritual, devotions, talks, whatever. And that's not my vocation. And so instead, what we do now is we just have these practices, and I'm leaving the rest up to God. We're every day, every meeting, we're pausing, we're reading Psalms, and we're going to pray. And if God then will shape our organization for his good and his purposes around the world,
Mm.
I want to leave all of that to him. But it's not my burden. I laid that burden down. I talk about that in the book. I laid it down. I'm not going to reinvent the wheel, because this wheel I'm turning is over 2,000 years old. This is the
Right.
wheel that Jesus turned. When he
Right.
walked into the synagogue, the part of the liturgy was to read the Psalms. And before he could have taught, he would have had to have read the Psalms that were a part of the liturgy. This is an old pattern. So I'm going to go wrong. If I go wrong, I'm going wrong with Jesus, is what I'm
Yeah.
saying.
Now, let me ask you this, Bill. I know it's not in the book, but how can an individual who's not in nonprofit, is not in
Mhm.
corporate America, just self-employed maybe, or just working for a mainstream organization, how can they apply what's in the book to themselves?
I think it's the same way. It's because it's what I'm applying to myself. And so I've had a lot of people who have read the book who are not leaders in nonprofit ministries, and that while they may not have a chance to pray the prayers in the back of the book with other people, and that's fair. But they have found the first part of the book helpful, because it's I don't know, Nazareth. I don't know, if I'm honest. I think God is doing something. I do. I talk to so many people who are finding life in not having to reinvent their spirituality every week or every year, or come up with a new thing they're going to do next January 1st for their spiritual lives that year. I keep meeting people who are like, what if can I just pray the Psalms, and can I pray the Lord's Prayer? I think it's okay. Jesus told us to pray it. Can we keep praying it? Again, is that going to get old? It can be, but it also can be brought alive again. But even if it's not, I keep thinking, well, Jesus said this would be good to pray. So it doesn't bother me to pray the Lord's Prayer every day. And it still hasn't bothered me yet. So everyone, you can do all of these things. And if you're in your work life, in your cubicle, you can still do this before your next meeting. Take a 30-second, take a minute, read a few verses of a psalm, say a quick prayer. And that's that. As long as you don't focus it on yourself, I think that's my big message, because I think
Oh,
a lot of organizations or leader will say, "Oh, well, how is this going to help my organization be more productive, or are we going to get more done in the kingdom?" I have no idea, but that's not the point. That
did
makes it
it
about
change
us.
anything for your organization since you guys started that?
It has changed the fact that we're all. Oh, I say it this way. I'll say it two ways. One is practices are just that. So they're consistent things that you do, right? So
Mm.
we do them irrespective of what happens on the day. Everyone knows a meeting opens, someone's going to read it. We're going to stop for a second. We're going to read a psalm and then we're going to pray. Everyone knows it every time. There's not a meeting that doesn't happen in. No
Mm.
matter who's leading it, what calls are going on. We may have 5 different meetings across the world at one time, right? All meetings are going to start this way. And then
Wow.
I would say that in meeting with people who have been at the organization for years, maybe over a decade, I'm meeting with them one on one. We'll do this practice, and so many of them have said to me, "This has really changed everything." I just want you to know, Bill, that this changes sort of how I interact or how I show up, because it's just different to be able to do that every time.
Mm.
And so I think it is impacting people individually. I don't know what it's doing to our organization, in some sort of meta impact outcome measure uh, sort of a way. But I know that it's impacting individuals' lives. And I think people know they can count on it. Um, and I think that they also, it removes fear. And here's what I mean by that.
Mm.
The last thing any staff person ever wants to hear the CEO say is, "I found a new book for us to read." no one, no one, no one wants to hear
No.
the book the CEO wants everybody to read. Oh,
Yeah.
and so the idea that I'm gonna have a new circus act next year, and we're gonna do this thing, or we're gonna try this thing. No one has to worry about that anymore. So
Right.
there's no fear around what's going to be different next year. I don't know. Psalms are going to be the same. We're going to show up the same. So that's a weird thing to say, right? Is that no one is left in like suspense, even sort of a bad suspense. I think it can be dysfunctional because there's a lack of reciprocity. I don't have an equal relationship with my staff because they report to me. Ultimately, I'm the CEO.
Right.
If I say read a book, they're going to have to read the book, and that's not fair. Or if I decide suddenly, if I'm a sort of a CEO that says, Nazareth, I hear you're having trouble with your marriage. Let me give you some counseling. You didn't come to me for counseling, and I'm not vocationally a counselor. I'm the CEO of a nonprofit organization, but that happens to people too. And
Mm.
so I'm trying to keep us in our lane. Our lane is to be a parachurch ministry, which
Mm.
means we support the church around the world and what she's trying to do. And I want to help shape our organization to be like
Mm.
Christ, and let uh, the communities of faith wherever our staff are members of their local church, that's where their spiritual formation can really happen. But I'm not anybody's priest. That's an inappropriate thing. Now there may be some parachurch ministry leaders who are priests. I'm not talking about them, but most of us are some sort of business person who's applying these things and running an organization. And I'd like to separate those two. So all of that to say, that was wearing me out. That was another exhausting thing
Mm.
that this sabbatical helped demonstrate to me a different pattern for my life personally, but also a way for organizations to practice that's so simple. But other organizations are doing it, and I think that's the beautiful thing I found is other organizations have started doing this too.
That's awesome. But I mean, I'm self-employed, but if I'm working for a corporation or a ministry and my CEO starts a meeting from the Bible or reading Psalms, there is that comfort. There is that okay, God is in control, is leading this organization.
Mhm.
And that's
Yep.
a great thing. And I want to encourage
Yep.
every nonprofit. You know what? I'm gonna suggest this to my executive director at
Yeah.
our voice. I'm like, hey, why don't you? I'm gonna get him a copy of your book,
Yeah.
but
Great.
I'm gonna have him to start
Yeah.
reading, like, hey, before any meeting, before any volunteer meeting, let's read the psalm,
Yeah.
read something.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
love it when before we started the podcast, I asked you to pray, and you're one of very few people that didn't go, okay, Let's bow our heads and go. You just took a breath and stopped, and then you went into prayer. That was really, to me, that has an
Yeah,
impact. It's like,
yeah,
yeah, he
yeah.
wants to go in the presence of God. He wants to enter into that, not just like just quit. Now, how did you fell in love with Christ? I mean, I know your parents were
Mm.
missionaries, but did you have your personal moment experience with the Lord?
Yeah, as I've gotten older, I realized that um, I have been falling in love with Christ my whole life. Um, I certainly had those moments. And I had a moment. I think but people say I was sophomore in high school. I remember was certainly a time where I was, at a sort of the stereotypical, youth retreat sort of a thing. And I remember saying, yeah, I really do think this is something that I want to commit my life to, right? So I remember those sorts of moments. But what's weird about that is even if I remember that, it's sort of weird to also feel like I never felt like I've fallen in love with him more than I have in the last few years. So what does that mean? What does
Mm,
it mean if I'm falling if now is more than whatever it was when I initially started saying, well, I started following Jesus when I was a sophomore in high school. I think it's a journey. It's what I love about, our salvation is it's being perfected and it's growing. And so I don't know that it had a precise beginning. I think that would be presumptive on my part to know when that work began.
mm.
But I know that it's been a life, and I like now more than I did when I was well. So I don't want to be a sophomore in high school again for sure. Um, but I wouldn't trade now for anything. I wouldn't trade now for anything.
Let me ask you this: do you do this at home with your family, with your kids and grandkids?
We we do. Uh, my wife and I have the same practice in the morning, so we're reading the same because we joined an Anglican church about 2 years ago.
Mm.
And so there's a daily prayer cycle. So she and I are reading the same scripture, and we get to talk about it sometimes in the evening. So it's wonderful. We've never done that in our whole marriage. So now we have both the same sort of prayer practice, but also we're reading the same scripture every day and get to talk about it. So that's wonderful. My grandkids, we've started taking them to church with us, and so that's been fun to get to sort of introduce them. Then I bring some of these liturgies into family events. When we have a Thanksgiving or something, I'll bring a longer, more thoughtful prayer instead of just pulling one out of my back pocket. That really tries to help us approach the moment, these celebrations. So yeah, it's affected more of my life. I said this all the time. I lost my shame of the gospel in the desert
Mm.
among Roman Catholic monks because I realized that they are not a faith-based organization. They don't modify their practices for their guests. They do the same thing every day. And if Matthew 26 is what they read today, that's what they're reading, and they have no shame of that. And it was a very it's just it's I've been so surprised at how often and how easy it is not to sort of in the old Campus Crusade way, share the four spiritual laws, but
Yeah.
I've had more easy conversations about Christ and the gospel and his work in the world since I left that monastery almost over 2 years ago than I have in my whole life. And it's just because I realized there's nothing more important than that the good news that the angels proclaim that Jesus came. Lo unto you is born this day in the city of David, right? And
Amen.
that's part of your show, right?
Yes. Let me ask you this: how much time did you spend at the monastery there?
I was there 4 days. Yeah.
4 days,
So
and you
yeah.
sleep there in the.
Usually they have guest quarters. Yeah, they have guest quarters. So anybody listening, I mean, and so I made that a pattern. I haven't been back to the desert, been to other monasteries and take a silent retreat 2 or 3 days. I've done that every year. Yeah, it's part of
That's
my pattern now. So
interesting.
yeah, absolutely.
How
Yeah.
was that? Is that difficult to be silent for a few days
It was.
in
Yeah,
the
it
beginning?
was. To learn it's more not the silent part as much as it is just being with yourself and not having distraction. That
Mm.
takes some time to get used to. And I say it's what does it mean to commune with God instead of communicate with God? Can I just be with him and not be trying to do something? That's a hard
That's
thing.
how can people get a hold of the book, and then how can people book you to come and speak at
Sure,
their
absolutely not. Thanks.
event?
It's easy. They put us out of business. Amazon.com. Yeah, put Christian bookstores out of business, but you can find it there, and you can also reach me. I have a website, billsimmons.net. You can find anything about the book, other places you can get the book. Yeah, The Way of Interruption. You can get it there. Find it on. If you need something for your organization, we'll sell them to you for $10 if you buy 5 or more on through the website. So we'd love to do that, help people out that way. And yeah, and then Hope Rises International. You can find our organization and more about what we do at hoperises.org.
Mm. Hope rises, hope rises.
Hoperises.org. Yep.
OMG. Perfect, perfect. Bill, thank you for taking the time. I mean, today your book just came out. You're probably extremely busy. For you to take this hour to be with us, I really appreciate your friendship, and hopefully we can, get together in person. You really
Absolutely.
encourage
Yeah.
me. I will
Yeah.
start that. Those seven
Yeah.
times interruptions
Yeah.
to pray
Yeah.
throughout the
Yeah.
day. That's gonna
Yeah.
happen
Yeah.
starting
Yeah.
tonight.
Great. Great.
So
Great.
I appreciate you. Thank you
Yeah.
so much for taking the
Yeah.
time to be with
Great.
us.
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks, Nazareth.
God bless you.
All
Thank
right.
you.
You too. Bye.
Bye. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you learned what I learned. I learned a lot from this podcast, and I hope you do that. And you hope you get back to prayers and to the Psalms and to even praying the Psalms out loud and taking time to really 7 times a day, 7 to 8 times, if you just would stop and just pray and just commune with God, just spend time with God. That would be great. If you want to, the book is on Amazon called The Way of Interruption by Bill Simmons. Also, you can go to hoperises.org and find out how you can learn more about Bill and how you can get him to come and speak to your organization, your company, your staff, your church. So, thank you guys for watching. Appreciate it, and please subscribe. That's best thing you can do to get more of these life changing podcasts. Is just subscribe to it and let your friends know. Thank you, and God bless you, and you have a great night.